Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Bowen Stewart and welcome to the 2020 OWF Medical Seminar. Today we have the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Lissimoni Kami. We also have his lovely wife, Dr. Jackie Kami. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Lissimoni. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining me today. I trust everyone is well and keeping safe and well in these unprecedented times. It is good to follow the advice that's been given out and also to act upon it to protect ourselves, our friends and our family. I'm going to talk about anti-doping today, and firstly I'd like to say that we're fighting an uphill battle as we have many doping violations. This has happened due to a variety of reasons, and I won't go into that too much, but major changes are happening as we speak. For too long, our sport has been tainted with doping violations. But most importantly, though, I'd like to say that it must be acknowledged and ideally rewarded that our Oceania region has not had any anti-doping violations for over 13 years. So I think we all should be proud of that. It doesn't mean that we sit back on our laurels and relax. I think we need to be more vigilant, and hence the presentations like these need to continue, and we need to be reminded to maintain that vigilance in the long run. Much of this is something that you already know about, and because we're doing so well, you probably don't need to know all this because you do very well. And I want to thank all the coaching staff, all the athletes, all the support staff, all the families, and all those who put time and effort into supporting our athletes for maintaining the sort of doping-free period that we've been through for many years. So anti-doping, let's just define that. Doping is defined as the occurrence of one or more of the anti-doping rule violations set forth as follows. Firstly, the presence of a prohibited substance or its metabolites or markers in an athlete sample. So essentially, if you have a prohibited substance there, it can be picked up. But now we've moved on so much in the testing that now we can check for breakdown products from these substances, which are called metabolites. And even further, they have put markers in some of these substances so these can be found when the tests are done. So essentially, the testing is keeping a step ahead, I think, generally in picking up prohibited substances and the breakdown products of these substances. Ultimately, the athlete is responsible for what they put inside their body. So really, there's no one else to blame but the athlete, and then obviously the support staff and coaching staff will be investigated after that. The second one is the use or attempted use by an athlete of a prohibited substance or prohibited method. Now, the attempted use is often difficult to investigate, but often admissions by the athlete, witness statements, documentary evidence, and longitudinal profiling, hence the athlete's biological passport. These can help to elucidate the findings in the long run. Evading, refusing, or failing to submit to sample collection. I think that speaks for itself. Evading sample collection, refusing or failing to submit to sample collection after notification. Basically, these are considered severe breaches of the anti-doping code. So this will be duly punished. Whereabouts failures, like the Adams. Any combination of 3 missed tests and or filing failures within a 12-month period for athletes in a registered testing pool. And we've had issues with Adams in the past. And we remember the case in New Caledonia, in which many of our athletes were unable to lift because of Adams issues. So remember to be vigilant about that. The fifth one is tampering or attempted tampering with any part of doping control, intentionally interfering or attempting to interfere with a doping control official, fraudulent information to an anti-doping organization, intimidating or attempting to intimidate a potential witness. The sixth one is possession of a prohibited substance or a prohibited method. And that is possession of an athlete in and out of competition of any prohibited substance or prohibited method, and also by an athlete support person. So everything is about the team and how we work together. So it's important that we are sure about what everyone is doing, and everyone is sure about the rules regarding prohibited substances or prohibited methods. The seventh one is trafficking or attempted trafficking in any prohibited substance or prohibited method. The eighth is administration or attempted administration to any athletes in and out of competition of any prohibited substance or prohibited method. The ninth one is complicity, and that is really just assisting, encouraging, aiding, abetting, conspiring, covering up doping violations. It's important that we, again, remain vigilant in not being complicit to such activities and maintaining our status within the IWF. And finally, prohibited association. So this is a person who's serving a period of ineligibility under the WADA or other organizations, and there are strict issues regarding any association with these persons. So just remember that it is one of those 10 situations, and it's not only about ingesting a prohibited substance, but it's everything else that is associated with prohibited substances or methods that constitutes a doping violation. So anti-doping, I think it's a pretty obvious definition, but it's the opposing or prohibiting of illegal doping, such as blood doping, the use of anabolic steroids, growth hormones or stimulants to improve athletic performance. Now, the rationale for the code and the IWF's anti-doping rules, the anti-doping program seek to preserve what is intrinsically valuable about our sport. It's maintaining the spirit of our sport, which is really just an even, fair playing field, the essence of Olympism, the pursuit of human excellence within the constraints of what humans can do without any other help in terms of doping, etc. The pursuit of human excellence, the perfection of each person's natural talents. It's really how we play true. The spirit of the sport is the celebration of the human spirit, body, and mind. And I think that's so important because at the end of the field, and I think more and more we're seeing that as the IWF and the IOC are stepping up in their prevention of doping violations. Now, ethics, fair play, and honesty. It's about health. It's about excellence in performance, character and education, the fun and joy. A lot of us enjoy being out there, competing, training. It's hard work. But in the midst of it all, there's a lot of fun and joy. There's teamwork, dedication, and commitment. There's respect for rules and laws, respect to self and other participants, courage, community, and solidarity. I mean, doping is fundamentally contrary to the spirit of sport. And so, as mentioned before, the playing field is changing with tighter controls and with recent changes within our organization and throughout the world in sport. Our time really has come. I just thought I would just bring up some adverse analytical findings. And this is just an example of what was found in 2015. And as we see there, we have the drugs that were found there, aldosterone and its metabolites, which is really an anabolic steroid. Boldenone is anabolic. Clenbuterol is really used for breathing disorders, etc., but also for weight loss. Clostebol, anabolic. And as we look further down the list, we see furosemide, which is a diuretic. We see methylhexanamine, which is a stimulant, and other things like more anabolics like stanozolol and testosterone. So out of those 14 doping agents, we have 9 anabolic steroids or stimulating substances like the growth hormone releasing protein. And we have 2 diuretics, 2 stimulants, and another one which affects the receptor for for um, for testosterone. So with all these sort of things happening, I think it's important to consider the side effects of what can happen when you take these drugs in the long run. So one of the effects is gynecomastia. I wanted to have a picture for this, but unfortunately I didn't get around to doing that. But basically, gynecomastia is a development of breasts, so female breasts in men. And that is because of the excess testosterone that's present in the blood. And some of that gets converted to estrogen, and hence the breast growth and enlargement. And often this needs surgery to correct. There's issues with poor sperm production, sexual drive, erectile dysfunction. There's also problems with liver toxicity, damage to the liver, cancer. I have had patients over time who have used steroids for competition, who are bodybuilders, and wanted me to monitor their liver function. I did not agree to their use and did not provide any of the testosterone and anabolics that they used, but I was happy to monitor their liver function and other things as a doctor to ensure their safety in the long run, and strongly discouraged that behavior. Thankfully, that did not involve any of our weightlifters at all. With the heart, we can have effects on the blood supply to the heart, so we can have ischemic heart disease. You can have issues with cardiomyopathy, which is damage to the heart muscle and early death. There are some famous athletes who looked the picture of health and won Olympic gold medals and died in their 30s. Those names I won't bring up, but you can look that up. You also have an increase in red blood cells, which can cause issues with blood supply to the heart and clots. We also have psychiatric effects, and these include aggression, dysthymia, which is sort of mild depression, things like psychosis, when you have mental health issues, and associated criminal behavior. Some people have issues with delusions of grandeur, which means they feel they're above others, euphoria, and acute confusional states. And also, research has shown that subjects using androgenic and anabolic steroids also exhibit things like dependency. So some of these people go on to using drugs like opiates and becoming addicted to that. So the side effects are not something that are very good to consider or to have, essentially. Tendon rupture is another issue. Often the muscle mass is quite big compared to the tendon size, and they don't quite develop quite the same rate as the muscle. But also they talk about tissue dysplasia, so they deformed. The tissue in the tendons are not formed normally and are bound to rupture. unfortunately. The side effects in females, pretty much the same as we mentioned. They have issues with hirsutism, which is excess hairiness. There's much like a male baldness. On top of their hirsutism, they have voice changes that sound very much like a male voice, very deep. Issues with acne, menstrual issues, and there are more side effects which are quite detrimental. So how do we prevent and do we maintain our status in our region of preventing doping violations? Interestingly, I Play Clean is part of what the IWF and the IOC have done, which is an education program, which you can find on the IWF website or the IOC website. And the outcome of I Play Clean has showed reduced favorable attitudes towards doping immediately after the intervention. They did an 8-week follow-up, and those attitudes remain. So I think ideally you'd want to try and stretch out their follow-up over months or years and see how much that holds out. But it is something that has been shown to work, because many educational efforts in the past have not been shown to be effective. We have the Atlas system, which was used in American schools. It was athletes training and learning to avoid steroids. It involved classroom and training sessions. The classroom segment talked about nutrition, exercise alternatives to anabolic steroids, information about the effects, which we've talked about now, and the role-playing sessions on how to resist pressure to use anabolic steroids. And this found that there was an increased belief in the athletes' abilities. They had more knowledge about anabolic and androgenic steroids and muscle resistance training. Better nutrition, they did more exercise and had a lowered intention to use anabolic steroids compared to the control group. The preventative benefits of the Atlas program have to be seen and experienced to know the long-term effect about this, and you can read about it if you look it up on the net. On top of that, we have the Hercules program, and that was similar to the Atlas program, and there are some links on there. Unfortunately, there's a bit of overlapping there. But again, it was doping prevention through anti-doping education and practical strength training. And I think it's important to realize that at times we can talk as much as we like, but then the practical sessions, particularly in those who are coming into weightlifting and early in their lifting careers, as it were, to cement the idea of the positive effects of training, understanding your capabilities, and understanding the adverse effects of using anabolic steroids and other prohibited substances. So all in all, I think we need to look at what we have achieved in our region. We have athletes like Eileen Vikamatana, Don Opelonge, we have Morea Baru, we have Richie Patterson, who's retired, of course, Kiana Elliott, and we can talk about many more who are world-class weightlifters and see what they have achieved without doping, but just through sheer dedication and commitment to training, and also with having a good coaching and support network around them. So I think everything looks great for us in the future, as long as we stand strong in what we believe and we continue to fight to prevent doping in our region. Finally, I'd like to talk about COVID safety measures. And I know many of you have heard about this. And of course, this year has been one of pretty much lockdown phase, and we haven't been able to have our competitions as we do normally. But the COVID safety measures will allow us to move forward in the future, especially with the Olympics coming up and other competitions in 2021. So basically, we should observe a social distance of 1 meter, 3 feet between yourselves and others, except those that are in your household or you live with. Wearing a mask in crowds when training or competing, those around you should wear a mask. Use a bar by yourself, but if you share the bar, then make sure you sanitize the bar well between lifters. If you need to go for a comfort break, remember to wash your hands with soap and water. And when you're finished, use an alcohol-based sanitizer to clean your hands before you return to the bar. Do not share towels, do not share chalk. Always keep up to date and observe advice from your nation's Department of Health. Remember, if you're feeling unwell, have a fever, cough, or difficulty breathing, speak to your doctor. Also, remember, if you have a cough, headache, or mild fever, self-isolate yourself, wear a mask to avoid infecting others. One important point is if you feel muscle or joint pains more than you would normally or after training or competition, please consult your doctor. Keep up to date with the latest information from your nation's Department of Health. Always keep up to date and observe advice from your nation's Department of Health. And finally, keep safe and lift clean. Thank you so much. It's so good to be able to share with you at this time. I look forward to seeing you all in 2021. Over to you, Bowen. Thank you.
Thank you, Moni. We'll now hand it over to Jackie.
Thank you, Bowen. Good evening. It's evening here at the moment. Good evening, folks. I'd like to thank the OWF for the opportunity to talk about nutrition. Moni was saying you need to talk about diet and weightlifting, and diet's a pretty interesting word. It usually strikes fear into the hearts of many. So I thought, let's talk about nutrition, how we can nourish our bodies and our strength. And I kind of was a bit cheeky by putting that extra 1%. And by that I mean, is nutrition the little bit extra that gets you to the gold medal? Maybe. I'm going to talk mainly about the Pacific Islands, Australia and New Zealand. But if I can just put some thinking into your heads to bounce around and mull over as to your own situations, then I'll have achieved my goal. In the Pacific, the nutritional situation isn't great, as many of you would be aware. In most countries, processed foods have largely replaced traditionally prepared and grown local foods. This is terrible. It's resulted in at least 10 of our countries having more than 50% of the adult population, or sometimes even up to 90% being overweight. Diabetes prevalence is amongst the highest in the world. We have micronutrient deficiencies, so night blindness. I mean, in Australia here, we would never hear of that, but it's out there. Other deficiencies. 40% of the Pacific Island region's population of 9.7 million have been diagnosed with a non-communicable disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension. These diseases account for 3/4 of all the deaths across the Pacific and 40 to 60% of the total healthcare expenditure. Imagine what we could do with all those extra dollars, put it into sport maybe. Also, some of these statistics aren't that much better here in Australia and also in New Zealand. So we can't, sit back and go, yeah, we got it much better over here. So what's going on? When we think about it, traditional Pacific Island diets are superior to Western diets in many ways, particularly in my head, what I call the cheap Western diet, which is what we see in the Pacific. It's not a good Western diet, which would be high in vegetables and have legumes and all of this. But what gets translated from here to the Pacific is white rice, white flour, white sugar, all the processed cheap foods that are exported from Asia mainly to the Pacific. There aren't too many weaknesses in a traditional Pacific Island diet, and their strengths are huge, and we'll go on to talk about those. They're uniformly very low in fat, between 10 and 15%, and high in complex carbohydrates, dietary fiber, and foods of plant origin. It's an interesting theme because often when we talk about Pacific Island diets, in the West, an image is conjured in our heads of, puakatunu, the roast on a spit pig, and things like that. But actually, if you go back to ancient times, people didn't eat that stuff every day. It was your taro leaves and your coconut cream and fish and what was gathered seashells on the shore and things like that. Certainly not very high in lots of protein, like we may imagine it today. So here's the ideal Pacific diet. They've done studies of a population in the Trobriand Islands called the Kitavans, and they had very low levels of, if at all, of the non-communicable diseases. And this was the breakdown of their diet. They had 4% unsaturated fat, 17% saturated fat, 10% protein, and 69% carbohydrates. So keep those figures in your mind as we go through now. So here they are. So the first statement there is just the breakdown from the previous slide. Most of their fat intake is saturated because it comes from coconuts. They have an omega-6 to omega-3. Remember, we always hear about omega-3s, the fish oils, ratio of approximately 1 to 2. Their average caloric intake is 2,200 calories per day, which is 9,200 kilojoules. They are the most amazing fit people you can imagine. They're strong. They don't get sick like we do from all those diseases that I've just mentioned. And so I would postulate that if you wanted to have optimal health for weightlifting, then I would suggest that Pacific Islanders eat from the table of their ancestors. And if you look there, that's pretty attractive. You've got a whole lot of food that you have to choose from. It's not a poor diet that you would have to eat to optimize your nutrition. So make this breakdown work for you in terms of optimizing it or hacking it for your weightlifting. So, carbohydrate quantities. There are suggestions that athletes should be eating 60 to 70% of their total energy intake as carbohydrate. This is within the ideal Pacific dietary intake range. However, many studies have found that athletes are not doing this, which I found really interesting, but perhaps maybe they're bulking up on proteins and they're not thinking about how much carbohydrate they're getting and the quality of the carbohydrate that they're getting. And I'll talk about why that's important a bit later. Okay, carbohydrate quality. In traditional Pacific Island staples such as taro and yam, these get digested much more slowly. Slow means more sustained energy release, which is something that we all would like to have, I think, particularly if we're doing things such as weightlifting. So eat your traditional crops for better performance, not white bread that's burnt off in no time at all. Proteins. So fatty imported meats, lamb flaps, turkey tails, versus fish, which is what your ancestors would have primarily eaten. I'm not necessarily in the islands where there's huge inland areas, such as Papua New Guinea. Then we would perhaps tweak it a bit to an ideal highlands diet, for example. But for most of us who live on the coastal areas with access to fish, that would probably be your main protein. And the pelagic, the deep sea fish, where you get your omega-3 oils, are also desirable. Then also, thinking about island chickens versus the turkey tails and the fatty imported chickens. I can remember going shopping in Fiji one time, and there had been a great hue and cry because they'd started importing these chickens from America, and I'd never seen anything like it. Under their skin, it was just this bright yellow fat. So I don't know what they're feeding them, but island chickens, they eat what they can and they run around, and there's no fat on them at all, as far as I could see, whenever we ate them. And they're really tasty. So, if you can, I know that they do sell for more though than those cheap ones, but maybe it's a small price to pay for the benefit that you gain. Okay, fat quantities. They're really important for our health, our brain health. We need a good balance of the three main forms, the saturated fats, which is what we all, having to get concerned about, but mainly because they're out of balance and we're eating way too much of them. The monounsaturated fats and the polyunsaturated fats. The recommended fat intake for athletes is 20 to 30%. So that's well within the ideal Pacific diet range and less than 10% saturated fat. However, in the Kitavan diet, they were eating up to 17%, but they were also expending a lot. They weren't sitting around. Neither are you as weightlifters. So perhaps considering that Kitavan diet kind of split is still okay for you guys. The Polynesians, whether they were conscious of it or not, had achieved that balance by combining coconut and fish in their diet. And a little interesting aside that I've been discussing with a friend of mine who's a dietitian here in Australia, and she was talking about coconut oil, and everyone's gone crazy for coconut oil and how great it is and that. And now they're saying, whoa, back a minute, there's saturated fat in this, and so what are we doing here, guys? And then I was discussing this with Monty, and he comes back and says to me, well, often the coconut oil was used for our bodies. We used coconut cream in our diets and in our eating. And I thought that was an interesting thing because because there's been studies that say, people who have coconut in their culture, it's healthy for them, but it, not as virgin coconut oil. So anyway, that's a little interesting aside of how we can take something and make it into something else without actually accurately looking at how it was used originally. Micronutrients, we don't think about these that often. They're the things that come in fruits and leaves and nuts, and like eating your red fleshed sweet potatoes, red fleshed bananas, pawpaws. You get your beta carotene, which helps protect you against cancers, diabetes, heart disease, the night blindness, the vitamin A deficiency, anemia. I found it really interesting. A good friend and colleague did her PhD in Micronesia, and her name was Lois Engelberger. She was a founder of the Island Food Group up in Micronesia, and they were bringing back the traditional crops. For example, the red fleshed banana was used in previous times as a weaning food for babies, which makes perfect sense because, it strengthens their eyes. So, and it kind of went out of vogue as all this rubbish food came in. And all of a sudden, we started seeing the kids with night blindness again. So she was doing all sorts of great things with her colleagues in Micronesia to bring back local foods like pandanus and red flesh bananas. It would be great to see that happen elsewhere. Now, this is an interesting little aside that I've been doing a bit of research on myself. It's about probiotics, which many of you may have heard about. And maybe you say, yeah, I eat yogurt, so I get probiotics. But I want to talk about our gut and who lives in it. Now, let's have a few terms. First of all, your microbiome, which is the entire habitat, including the microorganisms, so that's bacteria and archaea, lower and higher eukaryotes and viruses, all their genes and the surrounding environmental conditions, basically in and on you. So you're carrying around all these little critters that are microscopic or even smaller that you're not aware of. And the crazy thing is, the number of cells in your body is about the same as the number of cells of microorganisms that live with you. That's 100 trillion microorganisms that you carry around every day. So if you weigh 70 kilos, your microbiome weighs about 200 grams. So interesting. So what? Okay. Well, I have entitled this Lift from Your Gut. Now, your genome, which is your DNA, consists of about 23,000 genes. However, your microbiome, all those little critters, encodes over 3 million genes that produce thousands of gene products and protein, which are proteins. In other words, in terms of genes, humans are about 99% microbial. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So what? The microorganisms in your gut play a significant role in absorbing nutrient from your food, making vitamins, harvesting energy from your food, inflammatory modulation. So inflammation is what causes aging. It's a response that we have to a challenge in our bodies. Your immune response, and collectively contributing to your health. Okay, so what's that got to do with me as a weightlifter? Here's the interesting thing. Watch this space. I think this will be part of the future. Now, Bifida Bacterium, that's one of the bacterium, longum, subspecies longum, and then the little variety name, OLP01, was isolated from the intestinal microbiome of the gold medalist from the 2008 Beijing Olympics women's 48 kilogram weightlifting competition, Wei Ling Chen. Now, let's not talk about how they actually obtained this bacterium from her microbiome, and I don't know what they were thinking, what the thinking was to start this whole series of experiments. But let's look at what they did. So they got this little bacterium from her gut. And this is what they did. Now, looks quite complex, but it's actually not. They had mice. And they had mice that they stripped away the mouse's microbiome. And they call them germ-free mice. Then they there's 4 different types of mice that they looked at. One was the sedentary mouse, and he just sat back and he did nothing. Then they gave that bacterium that they isolated from Wei Ling Chen into the mouse, and he sat back and did nothing. And then they did the same thing with 2 separate mice, and one of them exercised and the other one had exercise plus the bacterium. And then they put them through all this stuff, which is at the top of the slide here: grip strength, acute exercise test, excuse me, endurance test, prolonged exercise test, a blood assessment, weight, feces analysis, and histopathology that's looking at their cells. Excuse me. So what happened? Well, the bacterium that was isolated from Wei-Ling Chen was combined with regular aerobic treadmill exercise training for 6 weeks. This is in the mice to evaluate physiological effects and performance. Results demonstrated that this bacterium combined with exercise training synergistically, so better together than apart, increased endurance capacity compared with the training and probiotic alone treatments. So this is really interesting. They're saying that by treating these mice with a bacterium from an elite athlete, actually, along with exercise, increase their endurance capacity with a bacterium. Wow. Moreover, this bacterium also significantly improved exercise-associated peripheral fatigue indexes, excuse me, ameliorated oxidative stress-related injury indexes, possibly through inflammation regulation. And from the perspective of ergogenic aid and health promotion, these probiotics could be further investigated in regard to functional activities in sport science. Wow. Wow. This is exciting. This is kind of a frontier going on here. But you go, well, I'm sitting out in the Pacific. I don't have access to these things. But I argue that perhaps, maybe not so much as getting something directly from a champion, perhaps, but you can tweak your own gut and who lives there. How? Right. Oh, hang on. Right. It's by how you feed the zoo. If the future includes optimization of your gut microbiome for optimal weightlifting performance, then how do I feed the zoo? With a diet rich in prebiotics, meaning before the organism. And these prebiotics are carbohydrates that are indigestible, i.e. they go slowly through your gut because they're so dense with fiber, by the digestive tract, which can selectively stimulate probiotic growth, the growth of these good bacteria and or activities in the colon. So how do we do this? Maybe with a diet like a Pacific Island diet? And so I started looking for evidence in the literature about whether or not our traditional carbohydrates could be good candidates to be prebiotic. And bang, sure enough, this is just one, but I'm sure there are more. One study looking into the prebiotic potential of taro, which is high in fiber, found that indeed taro is a strain-specific potential prebiotic that can be utilized as a dietary aid to modulate a healthy gut microbiota or microbiome. Don't eat the white bread. It does nothing for that 300 trillion little microorganisms that live with you, is basically. And your gut, there's so much that's important about how your gut functions, and we're learning more and more every day. So if you want to tweak your performance, look at what you're eating. Is it worth considering tweaking your diet for an extra percentage to get you to number one? or, to improve on your personal best? I think it is. So, what are you going to do about it? Welcome to the Feast of Champions. Um, I invite those of you who are not Pacific Islanders to consider what I've said here too. Maybe look at your own ancestors and what they ate, because there's suggestions now that we should be looking back to what our ancestors ate, because we've evolved, so to speak, to be suited to that kind of diet. I find it very interesting though, because I feel sorry for my kids, because they got a Tongan and a Scottish type ancestry going on here. So I guess maybe they better stick with fish, and I'm not sure what else. But yeah, I would encourage you to think about this and to talk with people who know your traditional foods if you've lost touch with that. It's more expensive to eat better. That's the same everywhere in the world, but there are benefits. And the other thing I'd like to challenge you guys, I mean, there are many of you are heroes in your own countries, you know that. And if you promoted the eating of these foods, you could significantly enhance how these foods are viewed by the populations in your country. And maybe you could contribute to turning those terrible statistics around as well. So not only ask not what food can do for you, but what you can do for food in your own country. Um, anyway, that's it. Definitely enough from me. Thank you for the opportunity to present some thoughts to you. And like Moni said, I'm looking forward to seeing you all again, hopefully next year. Take care, and back to you, Bowen. Thank you.
That concludes our seminar for today. We'd like to thank our doctors for their presentations. We'd also like to thank the Oceania Weightlifting Federation, the General Secretary, Mr. Paul Coffer, and President, Mr. Marcus Stevens, for their support, and also the International Weightlifting Federation for their continued funding for these projects. If you have any questions, any queries, please reach out to us at the AWF office. Thank you. Bye for now.